Tonight we're just briefly going to discuss about things to consider when you want to put up a tower for your antennas. Now I know I've seen many different styles and so on, and often I just prefer to keep quiet because it's better, because the hams always know the right tower and the right way of putting it up. And I just want to give a disclaimer. I'm not a structural engineer. This is not a definitive design guide. And for those that wanting differential equations, matrices, and Laplace transforms, I'm going to disappoint you tonight. So it's nothing like that. So I've simplified it, but I will at least try and explain the things you must consider. So we'll look at wind loading, and then the force components due to the wind loading, vibration and resonance. Often that's overlooked. Metal fatigue, it's most important when you come to your tower. Stress concentration, buckling, and soil conditions. So those are the topics we'll briefly discuss tonight. Now, the main items to consider is soil load-bearing capacity. I'll show you later why you must consider that. To a lot of people it's not important, but it is actually quite important. Then you must consider the wind, snow, and installation loading. When you install your tower, how are you going to get it up? Because there are forces involved in that. You could damage your tower before you even put it up, because it wasn't designed in that position, or you're hanging somebody on it, or there's 6 guys hanging on this end and 5 on that end, and it wasn't designed for that. So you could damage your tower in that process, or your mast, if it's just a mast. Then you've got the type of mast to consider. Are you just putting up a slender pole, lattice structure, a crank-up mast, a tilt-over mast? That's also quite popular amongst the amateurs, is to put up a tilt-over mast. Then the mass of the structure, and of course the mass of what you're adding onto that structure, and also allow for future additions. You know, you might want to put 6-element beams and 6-meter beams and multi-layers of them at a later stage. So take that into consideration. An important aspect is your projected area of the mast and whatever you attach to it. Now, when I'm talking about projected area, it's the wind loading, the face that the wind will see. And you can't just consider one side of the mast, because you must remember the wind can change. So you've got to consider that as well. What is your projected area of the mast? So if you've got a massive beam, often these beam manufacturers will give you wind loading on this side and that side. You must take the worst case and allow for it in the whole, all around your mast, because you're going to rotate it. So it sounds trivial, but it can be quite important. Then vibration and resonance, very interesting, it's often overlooked. Corrosion, of course. Then seismic acceleration. Fortunately, we live in a very seismic, quiet area. So, but if you are not, you must take that into consideration as well. Okay, you must please stop me if you want to ask a question in between. You're welcome. I've simplified this. Can you see the cursor? Not. Show now? Not yet. It looks like I'll have to use this laser pointer. It's very dim. I hope you can see it. Can you see it? Okay. The wind speed varies depending on the level or the height. That's why I've drawn these diagrams here. You know, it's very difficult on a PowerPoint to do a decent sketch, but you'll see there's a heavy arrow, and these become thinner and smaller. Theoretically, right at the surface of the Earth, the wind speed is 0. If it wasn't, the whole Earth would have been moving along. In theory, it's 0, and as you go up, it increases. It's like there's a quadratic effect, but I'm not going to go into that now. So if you want to then calculate your wind speed, so if we look at your typical mast that's got guy ropes, I started with that as a good example. Now remember, this is only looking at one view, but if you're looking at plan, you've got to compensate. You might have 3 guy ropes or 4 guy ropes, because the wind could come from any direction. But in this case, we're assuming the wind is coming from this direction. You calculate the load due to this wind speed, which then, to counter that wind force, you've got this force, I marked it here as Fa. But now, you don't have a horizontal line attached somewhere in infinity to hold your mast back. You've got a guy rope coming down at an angle. So there's a force, I just called it Fg for the force in the guy rope, which will be down towards Earth. But in order to overcome that that force due to the wind pressure, this force is going to be much bigger than that one. I'll show you in the next slide. In the same time, you've also got a force down vertically down your mast. Because these two forces, call it Fa and Fb, if you sum those vector amounts, will give you your Fg, which is the force in the guy rope. So that is something you've got to consider. And then, of course, you've got V, which is the wind speed. And bear in mind, it's not constant, it changes with the height. In this case tonight, I'm going to assume it's constant, and I'm not even going to look at the distributed load, because theoretically, or correctly speaking, the load on your mast due to the wind will be a distributed load. It won't be a point load like I'm illustrating it here. But this is just to illustrate the principle. And if you design this way, you've got a good safety factor. So that's the basics of wind speed. Now, if you take that wind to calculate the force due to the wind, it's this formula. It's very basic, and it's typically 0.6 times the velocity squared times the projected area facing into the wind. So, and that's basically the half of the density of the fluid times the velocity squared. So it depends. If you're working on the moon where there's no gas, this will be totally different than at the coast. But basically 0.6 is a good figure to use. This then times the area, which is the projected area in square meters, that will give you your force A, this force A here. And that is what you need to resist the wind at that particular velocity. Obviously, it's going to be different, as I explained, because of distributed load, and the wind's not constant all the way up. But this is easier to explain it this way. And then you've got your guy rope sitting here at this angle theta. So if you go and calculate now, you don't have to calculate it, you just have to resolve the forces, the components, because a force is a vector quantity. So you can do this with fairly basic geometry. If you take this force Fg in the guy rope, it's the force Fa, which you need to resist the wind, divide by cos of theta. You might have to check it. I might be wrong, but I think I have checked it. And then, of course, now you can then calculate that force. And as a matter of interest, I just did a quick calculation. Yeah, if theta is 60 degrees, if the angle of your guy rope is 60 degrees up, cos of theta is 0.5. So in other words, your force in the guy rope in this particular example will be double the wind force. So don't forget that. Then, if we now go at the force working vertically down on your mast, that's the other component of this force Fg in the guy rope. That is FA times tan of theta. So if you look at that, tan of theta is 1.73. So this force vertically onto your mast is about 1.73 times that of the wind force, the force caused by the wind. So don't underestimate this guy rope effect. And then some people over-tighten the guy ropes. And imagine what that does to your mast or whatever you've got. Okay, so that's something you must always consider. Now it comes to the question, I must go slow, we're almost done. Now comes the question, what wind velocity do you use? So there's an SABS standard. Now mine is very old, so SABS 01060 1989, but there's an SABS SANS code, more modern, so that's why I say this is just a rough guide that talks about your terrain categories. You've got different terrain categories. You've got to consider your geographic location. Are you at the coast? Are you inland? Are you sitting on a cliff, your mast on a cliff? Because that will affect your wind speed as well, the effect of your wind. Because the wind will come along and it will give a tremendous load, a higher speed up on the cliff. You must then consider your design return period. Are you designing for a 25-year, 50-year life, or a 100-year life? And then consider the risk as well. Life and limb, can you kill somebody if this thing comes down? Do you have your Lamborghini or your Ferrari parked under it every day? By the way, I wrote this before the news broke about those other Lamborghinis. Or is it just an old cheap GWM or something? So you must consider those factors in deciding what wind velocity you're going to work with. Now this is an extract from the SANS SABS code. As I say, it's an old one, and I did pay for it, so I think I can use it here. If you look at this, this is a typical map of South Africa. I'm not sure how much detail you can see. You can see fairly well there. In our area, the predicted or the average wind speed is 40 meters a second. And that, I say it's a 10-meter height for a terrain category 2. Estimated to be exceeded on average only once in 50 years. This, if you look at this area, yeah, it's interesting. It's 50 meters a second in Beaufort West. And in that area is 45 meters a second, which is quite interesting. I never knew that, but the rest of the country is around about 40. I don't know what the current speed is in the new standard. So this is just as for interest sake. I did the quick conversion. 40 meters a second is equivalent to 144 kilometers an hour. And then 50 meters a second is 180 kilometers an hour. And the definition of terrain category 2 is an open terrain with widely spaced obstructions more than 100 meters apart, having heights and planned dimensions generally between 1.5 meter and 10 meter. This category includes large airfields, open parklands and farmlands, and undeveloped outskirts of towns and suburbs with few trees. That's from this SABS code, page 37. So that gives you an idea what terrain category 2 means. I think category 1 is totally open, and then as you get built up, it's category 3, and because obviously if you've got a big building next to you, the wind loading could be much less, so you work with a different wind speed. When I designed my roof, I actually worked on 50. Yeah, so I thought, look, I'm not a structural engineer, but this should make it safe. Just as a matter of interest, you know, this 50, I think that river, that bridge over the Sundance River, that new bridge, they actually raised it up to the 100-year flood mark, because in some areas they had 200-year floods within 1 year. So things are changing. So, but when you work for yourself, it's going to cost you maybe another 500 Rand. What is it? It's not a lot of money if you think, it's for a long time. Okay, now we get to another aspect, vibration and resonance. I'm not sure if there are any pilots here or fly people, but you often see things on airplane wings, and that's to reduce vibration, especially the von Karman vortices. But flutter, if you've got a structure now, metal, most structures are flexible. Concrete, maybe not so flexible, but steel structures and so on are all flexible. So if you've got wind loading on it and it's really pushing, it'll bend. But now the wind's not constant. So there's energy in that steel that's being deformed. So it'll come back and the wind will take it again and it'll come back. That, depending on the wind and the structure itself, that can actually introduce self-resonance, depending on the frequency of this happening. And that's what they call flutter. The other thing which is also, I've actually seen this happen on quite a stupid little thing, but on a boom at a gate. I've seen the von Karman vortices, the effect of that. If you have a structure in a fluid, now here we talk about wind, and it's usually on a uniform structure, and the wind goes over it, and at the back it forms a vortices. And those vortices, the frequency, it sheds vortices around that structure. And the frequency of those the vortex shedding, depending on the density of the fluid and also the dimensions of the structure, creates a certain frequency. And that then introduces a vibration, which can also destroy your structure. You've obviously heard telephone wires singing in the wind. Or something like that's usually caused by that. Maybe you've seen it. I don't know if you've ever seen chimneys. There used to be one at the prison, North End Prison, next to the freeway. I don't know if you've ever wondered what those spirals are for. On this chimney, they had the spirals welded. I've asked engineers, and I said, no, that's a manufacturing thing. But that's not what they're for. It's to break the vortices. And here's a good example. They call them strakes. You see them on aircraft wings. You see little things sticking out there. They look, you wonder sometimes, what are those things for? But they are to break vortices. And here's a good example. Thanks to Wikipedia. Then, okay, this is an example, this is a simulation of what actually happens when you've got a uniform structure in an airflow situation. You see the vortices forming. Now there's actually every cycle there's a high and low pressure behind that object, and that's what causes your vibration. And if that is in sync with your natural frequency of your structure, you've had it, because it'll then start vibrating by itself and it'll just self-destruct. So be aware of it. A tapered mast is ideal in the sense that the dimension changes every millimeters. So the vortices shed on a tapered mast is almost nil, or it's very insignificant because it's different at each frequency. So let's say, for instance, the wind speed at that particular size will cause a vortex to shed, but just above it, the size isn't correct for that wind speed. So that's why you sometimes see tapered chimneys, because it avoids this issue. Now, another very interesting thing, it's the metal fatigue. My background's machine design, and that's quite a common problem. If you talk about presses that make millions of parts in a year, you know, there's lots of metal fatigue there. And I've seen things break and people say, but how is it possible? You know, it's so thick. I've seen shafts disintegrate over their cables, and they say, but what's possible? How can this happen? And it's usually due to metal fatigue. And what's very important, different materials have different properties. If you look at steel, if you look at this curve here, it's got a different endurance, we call it endurance limit. This is a SN curve, so this is the stress. Now stress is the load you apply to your part over area, the area that's got to resist the load of that part. So this is your stress and this is your cycles to failure. So that's why it's called the SN curve. If you look at this, excuse me, for steel, it comes down, the higher the stress, the less cycles the steel can handle. And then it gets to a point and it flattens out. So that's what they call the endurance limit for steel. But there are materials that don't have endurance limit. Aluminium, titanium, concrete, for instance, they don't have endurance limits. If you look at this, they use a different term. You then say, what is the fatigue strength of a particular material? And you say at 1 million cycles. After 1 million cycles, we don't know. Could fail tomorrow. So be careful when you select your material and when you decide what stress levels to work with. Because on a tower, there's always wind movement. And although there's you can see the stress, okay, we'll get to that later on, the stress levels doesn't need to be very high to cause fatigue failure. So this is something also to consider. Then, if you note the previous slide didn't show the SN, it didn't show a value for the stress. The reason is because stress concentration affect that value drastically on fatigue loading. So typical stress concentration factors are holes, welding defects, corrosion, lack of penetration in your weld, dirt or slag in your weld. So a little scratch on very critical parts can cause stress, fatigue failure. For instance, if you weld, what I've seen in industry, you weld, certain metals are not weldable. Like EN8 is not a weldable steel, and it's a common axle steel. People use it for everything. And then they wonder why their shafts fail. It's because the carbon content is too high, and they weld on it, and that weld has a minute crack. And that's where the fatigue failure starts, and within 6 months, the shaft fails. So be careful on your material selection and where you weld and how you do it. This is now typical from my ancient old textbook, stress concentration factors. I'm not sure, let me enlarge that a bit. If you look at this, this is now just a plate with a hole in. If you look at the difference, this is the stress level. There's your normal stress at this low point here. What happened? Oh, maybe the cursor doesn't work there. Do you see this? No. But okay. Okay, the cursor doesn't work there. If you see, there's your normal stress, but if you look at that bigger one, there's your maximum stress, and that's all due to your stress concentration, in this case, this hole. If you look at this graph, circular hole, your stress concentration factor is 2. Doesn't matter what the ratio is. Obviously, if your hole size to your material size is much bigger than the actual material, you can see up here the stress concentration factor goes up to 2.83. But it doesn't matter then. Eventually, you can make your plate as big as you want to and your hole as small as you want to. It settles here at about 2. So immediately you've doubled your stress in your material by introducing a hole. So or you've introduced a stress concentration factor that you must take into account when you do your calculations. Then a very interesting thing is stainless steel. This is a stress strain curve, and if you look at this one here, that's for steel, carbon steel. Now you can see, now stress strain again is basically force related, and then the strain is your elongation over your original size. So as you apply force, your strain increases up to a point. If you look at this one here now, you're up to a point, then your steel basically breaks. It's sort of, it just, the resistance disappears. But look at stainless steel. See, there's two different types of stainless steel. That's duplex stainless steel. That's often used in the marine process industry. There's no what we call a knee. This just carries on and on and on. So you could have tightened your bolt, and you could still be tightening it, and you're already in yield. Yield means now this thing's going to fail any minute. So, but you're not aware of it. So in the process industry, it's not allowed. You're not allowed to use stainless steel bolts at all. If you go on, let's say, an offshore platform and you think, oh, I'll put a stainless steel, you'll be fired immediately. You cannot use stainless steel bolts for critical items. So be careful and be aware of it. I use them also because the normal ones just rust, but be aware of what you do when you're tightening them and what can happen. I have another, I brought a sample here, and I'm sure you've all come across it. This is a 16 millimeter bolt. Maybe you can pass it around. Sorry, Chris. Now, if you can get that nut off, I don't have a lot of money, but I'll give you everything I've got in my purse. And as you can see, there's nothing holding it. And that's another issue with stainless steel that you've got to really be careful about, and it's called galling. It happens with aluminium, it happens with titanium, it happens with all materials that generally use or rely on that coating. Like stainless steel is only corrosion resistance because of the high chromium oxide layer. And those layers interact with each other on the nut and the bolt, and they actually bind under load. And you can't get them off. Those bolts, I have a box of them, came off a water installation where the flange leaked, and you couldn't tighten up the flange. Because of that, they had to cut them off and replace them with bolts, proper bolts. Now, what do you use to prevent that? Teflon. Nickel anti-slip. Oh yeah, but no copper. Yes. But I must just say, yes, I use that as well, but it's not a guaranteed solution. Be aware of it. It does help, but it's not guaranteed. Okay, that's about stainless steel and your yield point, which is quite important to bear that in mind. Now, we're almost at the end, so relax. Buckling. I don't know if you've come across or have ever seen steel beams in a building that's failed. But it's quite interesting to look at them because you think, okay, this beam was loaded, the load is downwards, but why is it like this? Generally it's got this bend in it, like a twisting bend in it when it fails. Depending, you get different failure. You get hundreds of failure modes, but this is now applicable to us. If you look at an I-beam, for instance, you've got the two flanges. You've got a flange at the top and a flange at the bottom. And if you load it, you've got the top flange the beam's bending like this. So the top flange is in compression and the bottom flange is in tension. And that's what holds up your load. Now, if you load more and more, the force in the compression side becomes too high and it starts buckling. So it's actually a buckling force causing it to fail because now it changes its position and then it can't hold the vertical load anymore. And in our case, with putting up a mast, the buckling is very important. You might have picked it up now already, especially when you've got your guy ropes. I'm not sure if anybody's seen that tower a couple of years ago next to the road at Kucha. I used to smile every time I went past there. Because that thing was really slender, really tall. It had the worlds of guy ropes hoping to hold it up. But what they didn't consider, I don't know what the history was there. I've got no idea. But if we go back to that previous slide, if we go back here, they didn't consider this force here, I think. And as the wind gets more, the force in your guy ropes get more, and likewise the vertical load, the buckling force on your, that's why I call that FB actually, because that's a buckling force on your mast. Okay, so now I must just find, we're back to buckling. Now, there is so the compressive load is much less normally when you talk about a slender structure than what you need for normal failure. So you need very little, and Euler, there's Euler's formula. There are lots of different modes to look at, but for simplicity, let's just consider Euler's formula. And the critical force, F critical, is the area of your structure, the surface area of your structure, times pi squared times E. Now, E is Young's modulus. For steel, it's about 200 times 10 to the 9 newtons per square meter. Divide by LE, which is the critical length. Again, divide by R, but this R is the radius of gyration. We can discuss that later, but it's not just the radius of your structure. A radius of gyration is the radius at which the whole surface area of your structure or of your part can be located, and it'll have the same moment of inertia. It's called the radius of gyration. Squared. So you're dividing here by effective length divided by R squared. You can imagine how this reduces your force that you can apply before you get buckling. So L is the effective length in meters. Okay, this is the same, but yeah, I've got this. This LE over R is known as what they call the slenderness ratio. And for steel, that should be greater than 90. If it's less than 90, you should look at this formula. Now, I'm sure if you've got a 6-meter mast, it's already, even a 5-meter mast, it'll be less than 90. But you can calculate that.
So, a stupid question. Would that be why it is not a good idea to build a mast out of angle iron?
Yeah, look, the angle iron is, are you talking about building a lattice structure or just a single iron?
Lattice structure of angle iron.
The difficult angle iron's fine, you can build a mast from it, but it's not the same in all directions. Your moment of inertia that you use in your stress calculations is different at different positions.
It's got the buckling component, which is also quartz.
Yeah, no, it will make a big difference because your radius of gyration would be smaller on an angle iron. We can look at it up later on. You can calculate it actually. So,
You can calculate.
yeah, no, I've got to look at the book. so your radius of gyration is more than likely very small, and if you look at your formula here, you're dividing by it, which reduces your critical stress. You know, you're dividing this term by this factor here, which will make it smaller. Does that make sense? But on the other hand, it's also not uniform, you know, and I'll tell you, to climb an angle iron mast is hell on your feet. Okay, this shows you the critical length, for instance. This doesn't concern us, but if you look at this, this is the typical mast. If you look at the critical or your critical length, it actually becomes twice the normal length. So in that previous formula, you've got to put, if you've got a 12-meter mast, you must put 24 meters in there, if it's a slender mast. So you can see what that's doing now to your critical force. It's immediately, and you're squaring it as well, by the way. So it has quite a significant effect. But you must consider that. Okay, if we then look, typically a freestanding mast, again simplified, I haven't showed the distributed load, I haven't showed wind forces at different velocities, but just if you look at equilibrium, that means the mast will just stand still. If you take the wind for the force due to the wind times the height of the mast, that moment, if we simplify it, that is all applied at the top, but it's not, but just for the sake of the exercise. We then take the mass of your concrete base plus the mass of whatever you add, your tower or your antennas, times that distance. Because remember, the wind wants to topple this thing over. And what's going to prevent it? It's that weight you've got at the bottom. So for equilibrium, the force times the height must equal to this force due to the mass, times that length. Now, I've seen the tendency for a lot of people they go for a deep down, they dig a deep pit and they say, ooh, that's a good base. Now, this is purely my opinion. I don't think that's a good idea, depending on your soil conditions. So, because if it's deep down, this L becomes very small. So now you need a large mass to counter that. But the argument is, when it's deep, the soil is helping you. I agree if it's in a rocky area where you've got very stable soil, yes, but that's beyond I don't know about soil. So just be aware of it wherever you want to put your mast, consider that. Now, you must also remember now, we just simplified it here, but your base plate and your holding down bolts, they all must be able to handle that load. So that moment that's caused here due to the wind force must be counteracted by your holding down bolts and your base plate. So if this is your base plate, again, you forget now about the concrete. This wants to topple over. So it wants to pivot here, and you've got your bolts here holding it down. So you then must design your bolts based on that, and this moment from this pivot point to there. And you must then also look at your plate. Can your plate handle that bending? You know, you can't just use a 3mm plate and expect it to hold up your mast. And then you must consider your bolt holes on your stress concentration on your calculations. So there are quite a few things. Now, if you come back to the soil conditions issue, I must just show you this. talk about soil conditions. 2012, I don't know if anybody remembers, but this was my driveway. For 2 months, I couldn't get to the cottage. I couldn't get to the house for 2 months. I got Stu Davidson in. This was actually after they were there. And they gave up. Patrick Davidson eventually gave up. They brought in, I think, about 14 tons of rubble and whatever. So if you go there now, you won't believe this. You would think this is nonsense. Luckily, I took pictures. I'm showing you this because where you put your mast and your soil conditions is critical. Consider that. Don't just think, oh, it's not important. Funny things happen. To solve it, I bought my neighbor's little Caterpillar. He brought it to me the Saturday morning by 2 o'clock. That's where it was. If you go and walk there now, you can't believe it. It's solid. So be very careful. There's the road at the moment is still there, but that's happened. We worked until 9 o'clock at night to get it out. So just be careful what you do with your soil conditions. It can be very treacherous. Okay, we're at the end of it. There's just one item I want to show you, the famous flagpole mast. I don't know, I ask you, what do you see? I don't know if anybody wants to. For equilibrium again, simplified calculation, what do you actually see here? I'll save you some time. This mass or force here, but remember now, that same condition applies all the way. The only thing that's changing as you lift your mast is the distance, the distance of this force. But when you're under wind loading conditions, the same situation applies because the wind is trying to push it and you're trying to hold it back. So if you now look at this, this force here, Fr times that distance, must be equal to that distance times that force there. If it's not, this thing will rotate. You must realize that. Okay, the ground will stop it, but that's when it's going to be equal. Or it'll topple. Now, if you just look at this ratio, this might be a 10-to-1 ratio. This might be 1/10 of that. So you now immediately have to increase this force 10 times just to lift that mast. And all of that forces is going into this little base of yours. And there you've got a nice circular hole in your mast. Some people just put a bolt through the mast. Ideal stress concentration. So you must be very careful when you look at this type of mast. Okay, any questions? Anything on the slides you would like to look at again? Anybody loosened that nut yet? Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope it was interesting. I hope it wasn't too boring for those that wanted the differential equations. Okay, thanks.